I'm Lydia Wilson, a journalist for New Lines magazine and the presenter of the BBC series The Secret History of Writing. I'm sitting with my friend James Montgomery, the Sir Thomas Adams's Professor of Arabic at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of the British Academy. This is one of 4 episodes in a series considering authors, texts and ideas from the rich heritage of classical Arabic literature.
A reading from Ibn Tufayl, Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. There were no wild carnivores on the island, so the boy grew up in safety, living off the gazelle's milk for the first 2 years of his life. He thrived and cut his teeth, following behind the gazelle who cared for him with kindness, carrying him to areas where trees grew. She fed him the sweet, ripe fruits that had fallen to the ground, or crunched with her teeth any shells. She let him drink her milk, took him to water when thirsty, shaded him from the midday sun, and kept him warm when he was cold. At nightfall, she would bring him back to the spot where he first landed, using her body as a blanket, as well as some feathers that had been placed in the chest he had arrived at. A herd of gazelles got used to their comings and goings in the morning and at evening, and the boy began to share their way of life, often spending the night with them. Throughout their time together, the boy grew to imitate the sound of the gazelle's grunts, so well that there was no telling them apart. And because he was so keenly responsive to the power of his will, he would also imitate with extreme proficiency all the sounds that he heard made by the birds and the other animals.
Al-Andalus of the 12th century was a tumultuous time politically and a rich time intellectually. One of the major sources for the philosophical currents and curricula of the day comes from an allegorical tale of a boy growing up in complete solitude on a deserted island, learning through experience about the world alone, without guidance or texts, and thereby discovering the laws of nature and spirituality. This text proved enduringly popular through centuries, languages, and cultures. Indeed, some scholars have argued that it influenced ideas in faraway 17th century England, informing the theory of autodidacticism beloved of philosophers John Locke and Rousseau, perhaps even influencing, indirectly, the more recent tale of a castaway on a desert island, Robinson Crusoe. This is Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, by physician and sometime bureaucrat Ibn Tufayl. Born in 1116 to an Arab family who traced their genealogy back to the tribe of Qais, he would have received a thorough education in Islamic legal, grammatical, linguistic, and theological sciences, and his medical training would have involved study of the Greek physician Galen and other Greek-Arabic philosophical texts. He reached one of the highest positions possible of his profession, becoming personal physician to the caliph's son. The work for which he is best remembered and the subject of this episode, Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, was written somewhere between 1177 and 1182. When he died in 1185, the caliph himself presided over his funeral. James, what else do you think we need to know about Ibn Tufayl's basic biography?
About his basic biography, not much. I think that's very, very comprehensive. Perhaps about the world in which he lived, because I think that has some bearing on how we will think about him. So if we trace ourselves back to the year 749, 750, when the then ruling dynasty, the Umayyads of Syria, were overthrown by the Abbasids of Iraq, Arabia, and Khorasan. The surviving members of the Umayyad ruling family escaped Syria and fled to the Iberian Peninsula, i.e. to Al-Andalus, to Islamic Spain and Portugal.
Yeah.
The Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus was then survived for a number of centuries, but then was replaced by a number of smaller states that we call the petty kingdoms, until a Berber uprising among the Sanhaja Berbers of North Africa, who were more of a reforming movement. They were known as the Almoravids, the Almorabitun, rose up and conquered North Africa, Islamic Spain and Portugal.
What kind of dates are we talking about there?
We are talking the century before Ibn Tufayl was born. Mm-hmm. So we're talking the 1000s, we're talking the 11th century.
Yeah.
Now, in the course of Ibn Tufayl's life, the Almoravid regime was itself toppled by another Berber uprising, the Almohads.
Yes.
Now, the Almohads were much more, I hate to use the word Puritan, but much more Puritan in their outlook. They wanted to reform Islam by bringing it back to a more basic type of belief system and practice. So for them, they're called Almohads because in Arabic their name is Al-Muwahhidun, and that means those who profess the absolute unqualified unity of God, the complete monotheism with no attendant saints and no attendant paraphernalia of worship.
Right.
And during Ibn Tufayl's life, his family had ties to the Almoravid regime. And when they were toppled, the family was able to maintain its ties to the new regime. And Ibn Tufayl, in fact, was incorporated into the new regime and became really quite successful, as you said, ultimately becoming personal physician to the caliph's son. But he also worked as a high-functioning bureaucrat to the governor of certain provinces in North Africa. And it seems that he also fulfilled other functions at the Almohad court based in Marrakesh.
And so this closeness to the bureaucracy and to the ruling powers, how is this reflected in his work?
In addition to the work that we're going to talk about, Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, there is extant a long poem on the subject of medicine. The poem deals with diagnosis, with materia medica, i.e. the simples and potions and so on. It also deals with therapeutics. Now, not all of the poem has survived, but what has survived is a poem of 7,700 verses.
Oh.
So the verse form that was used in order to compose these kind of poems, the very flexible one, but it's absolutely, it was used for lots of, in lots of subjects for teaching purposes. So this is a pedagogical text. The verse helps you memorize.
Memorize, yeah.
It's a mnemonic.
Yeah.
And the work seems to have been arranged from head to foot. So he begins with a description of the head and everything relating to the head and moves down to the feet. So as I say, that's incomplete, but some of it has survived. Right. But it's not very well studied. In fact, I haven't read a single word of it. Because
you don't want to know about potions.
No. No.
What else did he write? Although that sounds like a life's work, to be honest, but I know it wasn't.
We're dealing with individuals who were phenomenally prolific.
Yes.
And Ibn Tufayl seems to have been no exception. I think largely it's because many of the works were dictated.
Right.
And so I think that allows for more...
a greater output.
Yeah, greater output. A little bit like Winston Churchill dictating his speeches in the bath with a glass of champagne in his hand, right? It's,
we should try that for writing, perhaps.
yes. There's another work which we've lost completely, sadly, and it's on the soul. And that would be really useful to have because of the light it may shine on some of Ibn Tufayl's ideas in Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. There's we know of another work which was composed on how a famous Quran, which is known as the Codex of Uthman. Now, Uthman was seen as the founding father of the Umayyad dynasty, and this Quran was a symbol of the legitimacy of the dynasty, and to inherit that for the Almohads was an indication that they were in direct line of succession to the caliphate that originally began in Al-Andalus.
Yeah, the rightful heirs of the power.
Yes, and this codex, this copy of the Quran, was extremely significant. It played a prominent feature in court ceremonial, and so Ibn Tufayl is accredited with writing a work on how that was transferred from the Umayyads directly to the Almohads.
I visited that Quran. It's in Tashkent.
Right.
It's enormous and made out of vellum. It's physically imposing.
Yes.
And it's written in that Kufic blocky script without any diacriticals.
Yes, and you get about 2 Quranic verses per sheet.
Absolutely. Massive writing. Yeah, it's an incredibly impressive artifact. But anyway, I digress. Yeah. What else did Ibn Tufayl write?
We know of 2 other works. One, 4 lines of a poem on themes of renunciation and worldly denial. And this is a type of practice that would be very familiar to those who practiced Sufism, Islamic mysticism. So there's a sense there that this very short poem on these themes of rejection of the world, of renunciation of the world's pleasures and of concentration on the afterlife seems to be a part of how Sufis in Al-Andalus practiced. But finally, really interestingly, there's a boasting poem, a tribal boast, in which Ibn Tufayl summons the Arabs of all of Al-Andalus to join the ruling regime, the Almohads, in waging war against the Christians of the north.
Oh, that doesn't seem in keeping with the rest.
Possibly not.
Is that part of his political life?
I think so, yes. But I think also possibly, certainly the work on the Quranic Codex is part of his political life.
Of course.
It's an expression of the dominant ideology of the ruling dynasty.
Yeah, enforcing their legitimacy.
Yes, and we don't know anything about the work on the soul. That may also have had a political purpose because the Almohads drew their ideological inspiration from a theologian by the name of Ibn Tumart. And his ideas about belief and knowledge were such that belief and knowledge in and of itself is not sufficient. They must be translated into action. And so you could tie that, perhaps this work on the soul discussed such issues, but you can certainly tie that in with the 4-line poem about renouncing the world, because that is taking action in the world. And this is one of the big features about Ibn Tufayl's outlook that he takes from the founding father of the Almohad ideology, Ibn Tumart, that he wants to combine knowledge with action. And I don't want quite to go to sort of faith and belief, but it's faith or belief and action, but certainly knowledge and action. And knowledge as an end in itself for the Almohads is insufficient.
Yes. Okay. And for Ibn Tufayl as well.
Yes.
Well, I think part of why Ibn Tufayl is much better known than other people from this classical Arabic tradition that we're discussing, part of that is surely due to the fact that Hayy Ibn Yaqzan is far better known in the West. It went into Hebrew and Romance languages something like the 14th century, very quickly in its history.
Yes.
And we know that the famous English Arabist Edward Pocock brought back a manuscript in the 1640s,
Yes.
translating it in the 1670s. It was widely read. And so there have been multiple English translations, for example,
Yes.
unlike most of the things you've worked on in your career. There's already been so many.
Yes.
So I was really confused to learn that there's still no critical edition of the original Arabic.
Yes.
How is this? A text that's been filtered and read and discussed has been so neglected in terms of its original sources.
So it is unusual that although we know of the existence of 11 manuscripts of the work, no published edition of the work as yet seems to have drawn on 11 manuscripts. I'm not sure I can really explain it, except it's not unusual. So, for example, if we take a more famous thinker in the Arabic tradition, such as Al-Farabi, whom you know well.
I do, intimately.
Right? The second master after Aristotle, the great mid-10th century logician, philosopher, metaphysician.
Musician.
And musician, one of those astonishing intellectuals that the Islamic world throws up from time to time. We don't have decent editions of his work.
That's true. It's just a feature.
Yes, it is. And it's very hard to explain why. I think one of the reasons might have something to do with the nature of the discipline that I belong to, which is that it lacks one thing above all, and that's critical mass.
Okay.
Right? So if we were in classics and we were talking about ancient Greek or ancient Latin, there would be 25 editions of this. Every time a new manuscript was discovered, there'd be a big hullabaloo. A new edition would be prepared. There's not only the impetus that comes from the history of the study of the subject, it's also that the subject attracts a lot of people. And so in Islamic studies, the labourers are few and the subject is vast.
Yes, yes.
So you could, for example, in the case of an Arabic writing author, be dealing with a work that would cover 40 volumes. We're not in this instance. So the reason the corpus is vast.
Yeah, yeah.
The
work.
I think what that means is that there is a kind of expediency or a pragmatism in the discipline that says we'll just make do with what we can get access to for the time being.
Yeah.
In order to keep on going. Whether the absence of a critical edition, it may have something more to do with the fact that the work appeals more to non-Arabists than it does to Arabists.
Okay.
Fascinatingly.
Right.
I do know of a number of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan buffs, as it were, who are totally into the text, who are colleagues. But by and large, those who work in Arabic philosophy don't think it's philosophically demanding enough.
Right.
So they would rather work on some aspect of Farabi or whatever.
Harder philosophy.
Yes, so-called harder philosophy.
So-called.
And there is also this other reflex that because the work tells the story of a child growing up on a desert island, that it's some kind of a fantasy and therefore not worth serious study.
Yeah,
as
Yeah,
it were.
yeah.
So perhaps it should be left to people that work on the Arabian Nights tradition, or Marvel literature like the Ajaib, the Miracles of Creation literature. So somehow the work kind of falls between two stools, and I only know of it because in my very first job at the University of Glasgow, it was one of the things I was asked to teach because I was a replacement for someone else who was on sabbatical and it was on their syllabus. And that's how I was introduced to it. But prior to that, as an undergraduate and as someone who had completed 2 years of a PhD, I didn't know the work.
No.
So it doesn't loom particularly large, unfairly so, in the subject.
Well, that's a good introduction to diving right into it, I think.
Yeah.
But can you start by explaining its title? Can you try a translation?
Yes. So the word Hayy means alive, is an adjective meaning alive. Bin is Ibn, the son of, and Yaqzan is another adjective that means awake. So it's alive, son of awake. And the boy on the island is referred to as Hayy. Now, the title doesn't originate with Ibn Tufayl.
Oh.
He, in the introduction of his work, he says, I took the title from another work.
Right.
Now, that other work is by perhaps the most famous philosopher in Arabic, known in the West as Avicenna.
Right.
Who died in 1037 of the Common Era. Avicenna is one of those astonishing individuals that seem to sort of be a genuine genius, almost born out of nothing, but that's not quite the case. So
I mean, that's what he told us, isn't it, in his biography?
Well, he wasn't shy about his own accomplishments.
No.
The fact that he was a boy genius
Yeah.
certainly doesn't hinder his claims.
Yeah.
But he grew up in Bukhara, in modern-day Uzbekistan. And Bukhara, at the time, was not some cultural backwater. It had an extremely powerful, flourishing and rich court, full of mathematicians, astronomers, poets, scholars of grammar, scholars of the Islamic sciences, located on the Silk Road.
Yeah. Influences.
There's a story that Bill Gates wouldn't have been Bill Gates if the school that he attended hadn't acquired a very early version of a computer that he had almost unfettered access to.
Right.
And for Avicenna, that was the court library. Because his father was a court functionary, he was able to get the 17-year-old Avicenna access to this library that had virtually a copy of virtually every known work. And so Avicenna himself, of course, says that, being the Wunderkind, he assimilated all this knowledge at the age of 17, 18.
Yes.
And what he produces at the end is a sort of a compelling synthesis of all of the scientific, medical, and philosophical achievements that his predecessors had accomplished through reading and translating the works of Greek philosophy and science from late antiquity. And he puts it all together in a philosophically robust synthesis that then became the way of thinking about philosophy.
Yes.
When we talk about philosophy in the Arabic-speaking world of the past, there's before Avicenna and there is after Avicenna. Everything changed. It's sort of like an Einstein.
Yes. Yes.
In terms of 20th century scientific thinking. And so Ibn Tufayl says he had access to some of the works of Avicenna.
Yeah.
And
this is in the introduction to Hayy. Yeah.
And Avicenna wrote a work called Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, Alive, Son of Awake.
Right.
And in that work, Avicenna very carefully, it's a very symbolic, very dense work in which everything is chosen to represent certain stages of apprehension, certain stages of intellection, in the attempt to climb up through the chain of being or through the intellect and access the active intellect.
Yes.
Now, there's some evidence of that in Ibn Tufayl's version of Avicenna's work, but I think what Ibn Tufayl may have been doing was signalling his intention to produce a work in the spirit of Avicenna by calling it Hayy Ibn Yaqzan.
Right.
I doubt that many of his readership would have been familiar with Avicenna's work.
Oh, really?
Yes. I mean, Ibn Tufayl often, on a number of occasions, refers to works by Avicenna, and we're not really sure that he had access to the whole work or whether he was referring to other works that were quoting Avicenna.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I'm not even sure, I go out the limb here and I say I'm not even sure that he had read Avicenna's Hayy Ibn Yaqzan.
Okay, that's confusing somehow.
I don't want to make that a sort of necessary precondition, as it were.
Yes,
he takes the title,
yeah,
just as he refers to another work by Avicenna,
right,
called The Easterners.
Right.
The Eastern Wisdom is the way in which he paraphrases it. Now, in Avicenna studies, for many, many years, that gave birth to the idea that Avicenna had an esoteric doctrine.
Right.
And that has now been totally debunked.
Right.
So that one stray reference to a title set off a whole chain of investigation that was really just a wild goose chase.
Yeah.
And so I'm led to think that when he refers to Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, it's the title he wants and not the work.
Right, okay.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
But we do have a work by Ibn Sina called Al-Mashriqiyun. Al-Mashriqiyun. Right, that's not...
I'm not sure. I thought that was no longer extant.
Oh, seriously?
Yes, we have another situation of scholarship abhorring a vacuum.
Yes, it's true. So do we have his definition of Eastern wisdom that Ibn Tufayl refers to? Do we have Ibn Sina's own definition of this?
I believe, and I'm way out on a limb here, that we have a reference in one of Ibn Sina's works.
Yes, the Kitab al-Shifa.
Yes, the Book of the Cure.
Yes.
Yes, but
we don't. Yes, we don't have detail or an exposition of all of this.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the Eastern wisdom that Ibn Tufayl is referring to?
I think again, it's simply the title that he wants. It's almost as if he wants Avicenna's imprimatur. He just wants to clothe himself in Avicenna's name. But the problem with Ibn Tufayl, and this relates to the whole of the work, is that he is the type of author who is very, very generous with information, but very, very parsimonious with explanation.
Interesting.
And I often think that he is setting up traps. There's a degree of misdirection involved in Ibn Tufayl as an author.
Okay.
That a lot of people don't pay enough attention to.
Right.
So I think the introduction sets up a whole set of questions.
Yeah.
And he's very generous with the information. He refers to all sorts of works, all sorts of texts that he wants to attach his work to as part of the tradition. But I'm not sure that he wants these references will actually give us anything more than simply, as it were, a list of names that
doesn't adhere to the text itself.
It's not a sort of academic footnote where he says, in compiling the following argument, I have relied on X, Y, and Z because I expect you to go out as another scholar and check that I have, in fact, that I'm being veracious or authentic. And it's not that he's being untruthful. It's just that he's pointing us in a number of directions without actually really... He's creating a smoke screen.
Yeah. Well, in order to explore that kind of distraction, we probably need to talk about the content first, do we?
Yes. Yes.
So, should we just run through what this fable contains?
Yes.
And it's something I'm so fond of, you know. I think a lot of people are, aren't they?
Well, it's a wonderful tale. Wonderful tale. There are very, very few works in world literature that immediately appeal.
Right. And this...
and it seems very charming. And one wonders, you know, whether that charm is something that we bring to the text as a result of fondness for fables or whatever. I'm not sure that the work itself is particularly charming, although it has an appeal.
Right,
and it can charm.
Yeah. And there are resonances, I think, for a modern reader with Mowgli, you know, with boys growing up in the wilderness.
Yes, the wild boys in particular. There is, of course, Mowgli in the Jungle Book. And there is also sort of possibly... we should also think about overtones with William Golding's Lord of the Flies if we're talking about whether the work is charming or not charming. So after this introduction, in which Ibn Tufayl, as it were, establishes or not his philosophical credentials, the work has two beginnings.
Yeah.
Right? So another example of misdirection. And Ibn Tufayl doesn't tell us which of the two he prefers. So one version is of how the child, Hayy, was consigned to a casket, put out to sea from a neighbouring island by his mother, and arise on the island.
Washed up.
Very much in the tradition of the story of Moses in the basket.
Yes.
The other version is... one of spontaneous generation.
Right.
So it's more, as it were, apparently scientific.
Right.
The first story connects to the Quran. Mm-hmm. Second story connects to current medical and scientific thinking about what would happen in an island on the equator where everything is in perfect balance.
Yeah. So this stems to the Greek theories of the four elements
of four humours
and a perfect climate.
Yes, and here we have, I think, overtones of Aristotle's theory of spontaneous generation.
Right, absolutely.
But also we have echoes of Epistle 22 by the Brethren of Purity, which takes place on an island on the equator where everything is in perfect balance and it's unvisited by other humans.
Yes, crucially.
And so having given us these two origin narratives to explain for why the child ends up on the island, the story begins with the child's adoption by a female gazelle. On the beach. Now, the work itself is divided into groups of 7 years.
Right.
So the child's development to manhood is thought of in terms of 7-year periods. And the first 7 years is his arrival in the island, adoption by the gazelle, and the death of the gazelle.
Yeah.
Now, the death of the gazelle when the boy is 7 leads to the next 2 sets of 7 in which the boy, in an attempt to work out why his mother is no longer alive, first of all identifies the concept of death and then begins to dissect the mother to find out if there's something inside that could be fixed.
Yeah.
And so this leads to his exploration and conquest of nature, and that also includes the discovery of fire and of animal dissection. So by this time, by the time he's made those discoveries, Hayy is 21 years old.
But he's discovered the laws of nature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, just through trial and error observation.
Yes.
And through the application of a kind of pragmatic reasoning.
Right. Yeah, some kind of innate logic.
Yes. The fourth group of 7, Hayy then begins to reflect on the material world.
Yeah.
On the difference between singularity and plurality, on one, how the unity and diversity, for example.
Yeah.
And this leads him to conclude that what he refers to as form, again in the Aristotelian tradition, is not intrinsic to materiality. So he reaches the point at which he realizes that the material world is not all that there is.
Yeah.
That there's a distinction. That there's something else.
Yes.
That he can intuit.
And that's more in the realm of the ideas, or?
I think what the discovery is that there must be an animating force. So in other words, it's the identification of life, of what it is that animates life.
Right. Right.
And that leads him to no longer reflect on the material world, but to turn his attention to this animating force.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah.
What is it that allows dead material to live? And in the fifth series of 7 years, he begins to reflect on God and on the Creator.
Yeah.
Because he says, all of this must have started somewhere.
Right.
And the fact that everything has a commencement and origin leads him to think of God. He then begins to work out that God must be infinite.
Right.
And therefore, he realizes that the created world must be finite in comparison to the divine world, which must be infinite. Because the created world is the material world that has to be animated by something.
Yeah.
And therefore that something has to be a creator. And this leads him to reflect that he must have something inside himself.
Right.
Which allows him to understand this.
Yeah.
And that's the soul.
Right.
So he then thinks, what's the relationship between the soul and the world that exists beyond the heavens?
Yeah.
The world of the divine.
The creator.
Yeah, and the creator. And so he identifies 3 levels of existence. One is the body. The second is the celestial world of the planets, the moon, the sun, and stars and so on. And the third is what he refers to as the necessary existent, i.e. the creator who must exist because without the existence of that, how do you explain everything else that's around us?
It's very Aristotelian.
It is, yes.
The prime mover Aristotle came up with.
Yes.
But that animating force, the initial propulsion to life, or the world, Which bit, sorry to interrupt the heptads, but I've just got this bit in my head that I can't remember where it goes, which is when he walks around the island in a circle until he gets dizzy and falls down and realises that a circle is perfection in some way. And the reason I'm picking up on it is that every time, you know how children love going around in circles and falling down?
Yes.
I always think of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan.
No, that's interesting.
Where does it come?
Well, it comes where we are now.
Oh, well done me.
Because when he is roughly 35 to 49 years old in the 6th and 7th group of 7s, he then, by going around in the circle and twirling around in the circle, realizes that this frees his soul from his body, and he is able to begin to see the higher levels of existence that his reasoning capacity has allowed him to postulate the existence of.
So Are we talking about a whirling dervish in English?
I wouldn't. I don't know. That might be an anachronism.
Okay, fair enough.
Of it,
It's
like
the
that.
it's the circles releasing the soul from the body idea.
Yes.
That's quite Sufi, isn't it?
Yes.
Well,
Well,
now it is. I don't know.
now it is.
Yeah.
Whether it is in Ibn Tufayl's time or not
Yeah.
depends ultimately on what decision we take about the overall meaning of the work.
All right.
I think.
Well, let's finish the structure and then we'll get to the overall
So we get
meaning.
to the divine vision.
Yes.
Where Hayy is consumed with the vision of, as it were, ultimate and true reality, and he sees that there are three groups of people. There are those who are saved, there are those who are damned, and there are a massive group of the indistinct in between. Those who just haven't bothered to try to use the gifts that they've been given to engage with these thoughts.
Does that translate to the Catholic purgatory? Not really.
I wouldn't know.
No. Okay.
But finally, just when Hayy is almost 50 or so, his solitude is interrupted because two other individuals arrive on the island. Mm-hmm. One is known as Absal and the other is known as Salaman. And of course, up to this point, Hayy is doesn't possess language.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he has to acquire language in order to communicate.
Yes.
Which he does, of course.
Yes, because he's got this phenomenal reason.
Yes, which has been untrammeled by any outside influences.
Yeah.
So it's pure in that sense that it has not been clouded over by mistaken belief.
Right. False teaching and...
Yes, yes. And through his friendship with Absal, Hayy decides to leave the island and to travel to Salaman's island in order to convert the population of Salaman's island to true belief. But the mission fails.
Right, what happens?
The people are not receptive to the message.
No.
And in the end, Hayy and Absal return to the isolated desert island and return to their intellectual and religious meditations and practices.
It is a return, but it's also a different return because he now has companionship.
Yes. There is that. It is the companionship of a master with a disciple. Mm-hmm. And Absal is very much acting in the capacity of someone who wants to be taught and instructed in the wisdom of the master, to imitate the master's practices. Right. But the book doesn't finish there. No. Everyone thinks the story... Well, the story finishes there. Yeah. But the book doesn't finish there because Ibn Tufayl then offers us an explanation. Mm-hmm. Except it is such a dense explanation that I think it muddies the waters even more. And once again, we find that he is a very generous author with his information, but very, very niggardly, very miserly with the implications. Now, I think it's too long to read in whole. He says, for example, such is the tale of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, Absal and Salaman. Now, he explains, it comprises discussion of certain topics that are not to be found written down in any book or spoken of in any ordinary oration, for they belong to hidden knowledge, which only those with an awareness of God can accept, and which is within the understanding of only those who glorify God's majesty. Hidden knowledge. Yeah. Right, so what is the hidden knowledge? Now, he kind of teases us a little bit more by saying that he has, in a sense, misbehaved by doing this. Yeah. He has contravened the practice of his ancestors who guarded this knowledge jealously and refused to share it. So he's clearly contravening some code of conduct.
And we don't know what he's referring to.
No, we don't.
No.
And he doesn't give us the details.
Or who these ancestors are.
No, or who the ancestors are at all. But he does say that he has been so dismayed by the sort of corrupt opinions that have appeared in the kingdom that he felt that he needed to lift the veil from these secrets. So he's saying that there's a lot of misinformation that's out there, incorrect religious belief out there, and he wants to correct that belief by sharing some of these secrets.
Yeah.
And again, he seems to promise so much and yet actually give us so little. But what he does say towards the end of the final paragraph of the work is he asks for pardon for people who are familiar with these topics to accept my excuse for the points I've been generous in affirming and have explained in an easy style. Now, this is interesting. My reason was that I'd climbed mountain peaks higher than the eye can see, and I wanted to encourage in its readers a desire to enter on the true path.
Right.
So the mountain peaks, of course, are metaphorical in this case. They are the mountain peaks of access to the hidden realm. So he himself has obviously had an experience which is analogous to that which Hayy has when he receives the divine vision.
Right.
And he feels so enthused and excited by that he wants to share it with other people. And he wants to encourage people to begin on the path towards that knowledge.
He's had a mystical experience of his own.
Yeah, I think that is what he's referring to. And I think that is one element in which, of course, it's a mistake to read Ibn Tufayl as Hayy Ibn Yaqzan,
Right.
and Hayy Ibn Yaqzan as Ibn Tufayl.
Well, he's giving us that
He's
direction.
That's one of the hints he seems to be giving us.
Yeah.
But he's giving us lots of other hints that they may actually be more significant if we knew what he was referring to. Who are the would-be philosophers that he's condemning? What are the corrupt opinions that he wants to rectify? And then he goes on to explain that he's only giving us a tiny smidgen of this information, right? He's not revealing the whole kit and caboodle to the reader. He's only giving us a glimpse.
Why?
Your guess, I think, is as good as mine. I think partly in the end, it may boil down to the fact that this knowledge can be shared, but it cannot be communicated. It can only be experienced.
Yes.
So I can tell you I've had a mystical experience.
Yes.
I can't communicate that experience to you. Only you can experience that mystical experience, right?
Yeah.
And that is what the later, or the mystical, the Sufi tradition refers to with this wonderful word, which is dhawq. Now, dhawq is the sense of taste.
Yeah.
And so it's a type of knowledge that is so physical that it's, what's the Japanese word, umami or something?
Oh,
A lot of the chefs talk about that after
the yumminess.
that after that kind of elusive thing that turns an ordinary dish into an extraordinary dish. So to have an approach to knowledge which is such that we can share it, but it has to be individually experienced in order to be known.
Yes.
Might be the reason why he can't tell us.
And so is that an idea that's around at the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who was he?
Well, of course, the development of a theologically sophisticated and philosophically informed type of Sufism was well underway by that time. Yeah. And in fact, we know from Ibn Tufayl's own chain of discipleship that we can trace him back to a famous mystic in Baghdad at the beginning of the 12th century.
Okay.
The brother of one of the other most famous figures in Islam, Al-Ghazali.
Oh.
So not Abu Hamid, but his brother.
Right.
Who is a more famous as a theorizer of Sufism.
Right.
And so Ibn Tufayl's spiritual genealogy traces back
right
to this brother of Ghazali. But the concept of dhawq, was well developed as a way of describing.
When we go back to the brief sketch of his life in bureaucracy and as a working doctor to the caliph's son,
yes,
it doesn't seem that close to life on a desert island achieving mystical communion with the divine.
Yeah.
What's the link?
Well, I think the desert island is that, as I said earlier, to posit an individual that has no external influences, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure that we all need the desert island to
achieve mystical communion.
But what we do need to do is to strip away all the false beliefs and create a desert island interior desert island for ourselves in order to be able to begin this journey.
And that, as long as we've done the interior work, it's okay to live in a political, worldly setting.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yeah, very much so, because remember, the Al-Mahad doctrine of no knowledge without action.
Right.
Right? So, and this ties in with the founding belief in the absolute unqualified unicity of the Godhead, of Tawheed in Arabic, the unqualified monotheism with no other accoutrements or qualifications or whatever. And so this demands a sort of unqualified dedication.
But then, if we go back to Hayy, the action you could consider being the proselytizing.
Yes, it is. That's why he goes to the other island.
But he fails. The action fails.
Yeah, but is that Hay's fault, or is that the
world?
The fault of the people that were not receptive to the message?
But he gives up. He returns to the island.
He does. Yes.
But is that pragmatism because he's realised?
I don't know. That is, of course, the big question. Why does he give up? And is that, in fact, a warning or a program on the part of Ibn Tufayl? Is it a warning to Al-Mahad society that they're not being receptive enough to the message? Or is it a solution that the individual who has this experience of dhawq and so on, with enough of them, then society changes incrementally, individually, rather than collectively. So an individual solution or a collective solution. I've pondered this for many, many years. In fact, I taught this text to a group of undergraduates about 10 years ago. And the course was on political philosophy.
Right.
Because this is the real conundrum. What is the social recipe that the text is giving us?
Did he mean it to be unanswered?
Well, we have to presume so, because
there aren't any answers.
There aren't any answers that he's given us, he's given us enough indication that we need to think about false philosophers, corrupt opinions.
Yeah. But those lessons hold.
Yeah, but how those are all woven together in the end remains really down to the reader, to the individual experience, which is why I was talking earlier about it being Ibn Tufayl being a writer that loves misdirection.
Right.
In a very profound way, and of course a lot of people who discuss the work who are interested in philosophy, I've even seen one translation of the work that gets rid of the introduction, that just begins.
How?
Well, it just doesn't
just
translate
as the story.
It just begins with the baby in the basket.
What's the explanation for leaving out the author's own introduction?
Well, I don't know. I couldn't presume to think on behalf of someone else in that case.
So, to sum up, what would you want the reader to be left with? What impression? Is it a philosophical text? Is it a Sufi text? Is it a text of spiritual instruction? How would you characterise it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Clearly, as we've discussed in the course of our chat, there's a lot of Aristotle and there's a lot of philosophy in there.
Yeah.
And clearly, on the other hand, as we discussed in the concept of Dhawq, there's a lot of tasawwuf, of Sufism, of Islamic mysticism in there. And clearly, from our other discussion, there's also a lot of Almohad ideology somewhere in the background. And I think when I first read this text as a teacher and when taught it subsequently, I was more informed about the philosophical side of the work than I was about the Sufi side of the work. And I would have, if you'd asked me this 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, I'd have said it's a philosophical work.
Right.
Which is trying to, as it were, establish in an area that wasn't always receptive to Greco-Arabic philosophical ideas, philosophy in a dominant idiom. But I have subsequently spent quite a bit of time working on philosophical Sufism, largely through working with various colleagues. And I'm, when I taught this recently to a group of fourth years, and at the end of teaching and so on, I was almost managed to convince myself that it's a Sufi text.
Right.
And I think the next thing to begin to do is, as I said earlier, the study of Islamic Spain is one of the really interesting areas in our discipline. And recently there has been some effort devoted to Sufi practices in North Africa, among the Berber tribes, i.e. among the people that produced the Almohad and the Almoravid dynasties.
Yeah.
And I've come to the conclusion that this work represents a sort of stepping stone on the way towards a fully fledged development of a kind of philosophical Sufism that then emerges in the subsequent century as a fully fledged and fully integrated doctrine.
Right.
And of course, we must remember that one of the most spiritually significant individuals in the history of classical Islam is Ibn al-Arabi. Now, he was a younger contemporary of Ibn Tufayl.
Did they know each other?
Well, we don't know.
We don't know.
But Ibn al-Arabi was born in 1165. So it's not impossible that there was some form of contact. Now, what Ibn al-Arabi did was, of course, produce this amazing theory of that accounts for that satisfies spiritually and emotionally as well as intellectually.
Yes, synthesized.
And it becomes the sort of one of the dominant paradigms in the whole of the Muslim world.
Yes.
And remains very, very powerful to this day. I mean, we have Ibn Arabi societies and
all over the world.
It's really hard to get across to the listener a sense of his importance. And I'm not by any means an expert on Ibn al-Arabi, and I wouldn't claim to be. But from what I know about Ibn al-Arabi's synthesis, I've begun to convince myself that Ibn Tufayl is like a sort of missing link on the step towards the emergence of Ibn al-Arabi's philosophical Sufism.
Right.
Because there's the Neoplatonizing tendencies, there's the ascetic tendencies. There's all sorts of areas that they have in common.
Yeah. And even the genre of fable, right?
Yes.
Of teaching through story, because as you mentioned earlier, there's no replacement for direct experience. You can't be told it.
Yes.
So you need these other ways into knowledge.
Yes. So I think more conservatively that I would say that Ibn Tufayl's text is probably a window on to something that was happening in Al-Andalus at the time.
But at the formative stages, at a crucible stage.
Yes.
That makes it very exciting.
It just opens up that when we look at it from that point of view and forget about what he owes to Aristotle and forget about... So when we just think about it in terms of its sort of late 12th century Almohad context, it opens a kind of window to the sort of ideas and beliefs and possibly emotional spirituality that is starting to emerge.
Yeah.
And it becomes, as it were, the material that the spontaneous generation of an expert like Ibn al-Arabi, of a genius like Ibn al-Arabi, needs in order to flourish.
That's a brilliant way to end, and I hope that the many versions in English will be appreciated by people who didn't know about this before.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so too.
Thank you. Thank you very much for downloading this podcast.